The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew before I even opened it that my peaceful life by the lake was about to end. Inside, 3 pages of legal threats over a simple wooden dock that had been there longer than the HOA president herself had even lived in our community. But what started as an attempt to steal my family's legacy would end with me owning the largest private marina in 3 counties. And Karen, well, let's just say she learned that some battles aren't worth picking. My name is David, and this is the story of how one vindictive HOA president's obsession with control backfired so spectacularly that it changed not just my life, but the entire character of our lakeside community forever. What you're about to hear involves family secrets buried for decades, legal maneuvers that would make corporate lawyers jealous, and a showdown that left an entire HOA board speechless. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all began, to a simpler time when I thought the biggest problem in my life was deciding whether to stain my dock this spring or wait until fall. I inherited my grandfather's house on Lake Harmony 3 years ago, along with everything that came with it. The modest 2-bedroom cottage, the mature oak trees, the flower beds my grandmother had tended for 40 years, and yes, the dock. That beautiful hand-built dock that extended 30 feet into the crystal-clear water, where I spent my mornings with coffee and my evenings watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. The dock wasn't just wood and nails to me. It was where my grandfather had taught me to fish when I was 7 years old, where my grandmother had sat reading her romance novels every summer afternoon, and where I'd proposed to my ex-wife 15 years earlier. Every weathered board held a memory. Every nail had been driven with love and intention. When I moved in permanently after my divorce, I thought I'd found my sanctuary. The other residents seemed friendly enough, quiet retirees mostly, a few young families, the kind of people who waved when they passed and minded their own business. The HOA meetings were supposedly just formalities, rubber-stamping decisions about snow removal and community garden maintenance. I should have known better. The trouble started innocently enough. I was replacing a few loose boards on the dock one Saturday morning when I noticed a woman standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed, wearing what I can only describe as the uniform of a suburban enforcer, pressed khakis, a polo shirt with some kind of board certification pin, and sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority that immediately puts you on guard. "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Lake Harmony, HOA. I don't believe we've met." I set down my hammer and walked over, trying to be neighborly. "Hi there, I'm David Morrison. Nice to finally meet you in person." She didn't extend her hand. Instead, she was looking past me at the dock with the intensity of a building inspector. "That's quite an impressive structure you have there." "Thanks. My grandfather built it back in 1987. Solid construction, hasn't needed major work in decades." Her smile was thin, calculated. 1987, you said? Interesting. And you're doing repairs without permits, I see. The way she said it made my stomach drop. "Permits? I'm just replacing a few boards. It's routine maintenance." "Mom?" She pulled out her phone and took several photos of my dock, then of me standing there holding my hammer. "I'll need to look into this. The HOA has very specific rules about waterfront modifications. But this isn't a modification, it's..." "I'll be in touch, Mr. Morrison." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with a growing sense of dread that I couldn't quite shake. That evening, I pulled out the HOA documents I'd received when I inherited the property. I'd barely glanced at them before, figuring they were standard boilerplate about keeping your grass cut and not painting your house hot pink. But as I read through the waterfront regulations, a chill ran down my spine. The rules were extensive, detailed, and recent. Very recent. According to the revision dates, most of the waterfront regulations had been updated just 6 months ago, long after my grandfather's dock had been built. There were requirements for setbacks, materials specifications, environmental impact studies, and most importantly, a clause stating that any non-compliant structures would be considered ongoing violations subject to immediate enforcement action. I called my neighbor Frank, an elderly widower who'd lived here since the community was first developed. Frank had been friends with my grandfather, and if anyone would know the history of these regulations, it would be him. "Oh, you met Patricia," Frank chuckled when I described my encounter. "Don't take it personally, son. She's been on a tear lately, trying to modernize the community. Between you and me, I think she's got her eye on running for city council, and she wants to make a name for herself as someone who gets things done. But my grandfather's dock has been here for over 30 years. Surely it's grandfathered in?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. "David, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Patricia's been asking questions about your property for months, even before you moved in permanently. She came by asking me about the dock, about when it was built, whether it had permits. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough. My heart sank. What did you tell her?" "The truth. That your grandfather built it himself, that it was beautiful craftsmanship, that it had never caused any problems. But I also mentioned—" Frank's voice trailed off. "What? What did you mention?" "I might have said something about how prime that waterfront location is. How if someone wanted to put in a really impressive dock, yours would be the perfect spot for it. The pieces were starting to come together, and I didn't like the picture they were forming." "Frank, does Patricia live on the water?" "No, she's 3 streets back. But her lot backs up to the Hendersons' place, and they've got that narrow strip of lakefront. Not nearly enough room for a proper dock, and the water's too shallow anyway." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the gentle lapping of water against my dock outside. Something told me this was just the beginning of a much larger battle, and I was right. The certified letter arrived the following Tuesday. The letter was everything I'd feared and worse. 3 pages of legal-sounding language that basically boiled down to remove your dock within 30 days or face daily fines of $500, plus legal action to force compliance. The HOA claimed that my dock violated setback requirements, exceeded allowable square footage, and was built without proper permits or environmental review. But it was the last paragraph that made my blood run cold. Additionally, the HOA board has voted to revoke waterfront access privileges for non-compliant structures. Failure to remove the dock will result in loss of lake access rights for the property. They were threatening to cut off my access to the lake entirely. I called the number on the letterhead immediately, reaching Patricia's crisp, professional voicemail. When she called back 2 hours later, her tone had none of the fake friendliness from our first meeting. "Mr. Morrison, I trust you received our correspondence." "I did, and I have to say I'm confused. This dock has been here for over 30 years. How can you suddenly declare it illegal?" The HOA has the authority to enforce compliance with current regulations. The fact that previous boards may have overlooked violations doesn't grandfather in non-compliant structures. But the regulations you're citing weren't even written when this dock was built. That's irrelevant. The community standards have evolved, and all residents must comply with current rules. The dock must be removed by the deadline specified in the notice. I felt my hands starting to shake. "Patricia, this dock isn't just a structure to me. It's been in my family for decades. Surely we can work something out. Maybe I can modify it to meet the current standards?" Her laugh was cold. "Mr. Morrison, the current regulations require a minimum setback of 15 feet from property lines, environmental impact studies, and compliance with state waterway regulations that didn't exist in 1987. Your dock fails on every count. Removal is the only option. And if I refuse, then you'll face daily fines, legal action, and ultimately loss of lake access. I'd strongly advise against that course of action. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring out at the dock where my grandfather had spent so many peaceful hours. The injustice of it burned in my chest. This wasn't about regulations or community standards. This was about power, and Patricia Hendricks was flexing hers. But I wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse to research the property records. What I found there started to paint a clearer picture of what was really happening. Patricia Hendricks had purchased her property just 3 years ago, around the same time she joined the HOA board. But more interesting was the fact that she'd been making inquiries about purchasing waterfront lots, including several attempts to buy property adjacent to mine. I also discovered that my grandfather had indeed pulled permits for the dock back in 1987, permits that were perfectly legal and valid under the regulations in place at the time. The county clerk, a helpful woman named Mrs. Chen, helped me locate the original inspection records. "This is good work," she said, examining the faded documents. "Your grandfather followed all the proper procedures." The dock was inspected and approved by both the county and the state environmental office. So it's legal? It was legal when it was built, and there's nothing in these records suggesting that's changed. The question is whether the HOA has the authority to override county permits. That afternoon, I drove to the state environmental office to dig deeper. What I found there was even more interesting. The state had recently completed a comprehensive study of Lake Harmony's ecosystem, and my dock, along with several others in the community, had been specifically noted as examples of environmentally conscious waterfront construction. According to the report, the older docks like mine actually provided better fish habitat than newer structures, because they'd been built with untreated lumber that had developed natural algae growth over the decades. The study recommended that similar structures be preserved as beneficial to the lake's ecosystem. Armed with this information, I requested a meeting with the HOA board. Patricia reluctantly agreed to put me on the agenda for the next monthly meeting, but her tone made it clear she considered it a waste of everyone's time. The meeting was held in the community center, a modest building that doubled as a polling place during elections. I arrived early, carrying a folder full of permits, environmental reports, and historical photographs of my grandfather building the dock. I'd expected a small gathering, maybe the 5 board members and a handful of residents. Instead, I walked into a room packed with nearly 50 people. Patricia was at the front, flanked by 4 other board members I didn't recognize. As I took a seat in the back, I noticed that most of the audience seemed to be on Patricia's side of the room, whispering among themselves and shooting unfriendly glances in my direction. Before we begin, Patricia announced, her voice carrying easily through the room, "I want to remind everyone that tonight's discussion concerns a clear violation of our community standards. The HOA board has already voted on this matter, but Mr. Morrison has requested an opportunity to present his case." She said it like I was asking for charity, not exercising my rights as a homeowner. When my turn came, I stood up and methodically presented my evidence. I showed them the original permits, the environmental study, the historical significance of the dock. I explained that my grandfather had followed every rule and regulation in place at the time of construction. The dock isn't just legal, I concluded. It's been specifically recognized by the state as beneficial to the lake's ecosystem. Removing it would actually harm the environment you're claiming to protect. There was murmuring from the crowd, and for a moment I thought I might be getting through to them. Then Patricia stood up. "Mr. Morrison, while we appreciate your passion for this structure, the fact remains that it doesn't comply with current regulations. The HOA board has a responsibility to maintain consistent standards throughout the community." She gestured toward a poster board that hadn't been there when I arrived. As you can see from these photographs, Mr. Morrison's dock is significantly larger than other structures on the lake. It creates an unfair precedent and, frankly, diminishes property values for other waterfront owners. The photographs showed my dock from several angles, but they'd been taken with a telephoto lens that made it appear much larger than it actually was. Worse, they'd been compared to photos of smaller, newer docks that made mine look like a commercial pier. Furthermore, Patricia continued, we've received numerous complaints from other residents about the dock's appearance and its impact on their lake views. This was news to me. In 3 years of living there, I'd never received a single complaint about my dock. I looked around the room, trying to identify which of my neighbors might have objected, but most of the faces were unfamiliar. Could you tell me who made these complaints? I asked. Patricia's smile was patronizing. HOA complaint records are confidential to protect residents' privacy. But I can assure you that the concerns are legitimate and widespread. The meeting went downhill from there. One by one, people I'd never seen before stood up to voice their concerns about my oversized dock, its environmental impact, and its precedent-setting non-compliance. A few residents tried to speak in my favor, including Frank, but they were quickly shouted down. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear that I wasn't just fighting Patricia anymore. Somehow, she'd managed to turn the entire community against me, and I had no idea how. But, as I was packing up my documents, something caught my eye. One of the women who'd spoken most passionately against my dock was wearing a name tag. "Hello, my name is Susan, new resident, welcome committee." New residents. That explained a lot. Over the following weeks, the harassment escalated. I started receiving anonymous letters in my mailbox, nasty threatening notes about dock cheats and selfish neighbors. Someone spray-painted REMOVEIT on my garage door. My car tires were slashed twice. The daily fines began accumulating $500 per day, as promised. Within 2 weeks, I owed the HOA over $7,000, with more added every morning like some kind of nightmare debt clock. But the worst part was the isolation. Neighbors who had waved to me before now crossed the street to avoid me. My invitations to community events were rescinded. Even the local grocery store seemed hostile. I overheard whispered conversations about that guy with the illegal dock whenever I walked down the aisles. Frank remained loyal, stopping by every few days to check on me and share what he was hearing through the neighborhood grapevine. The news wasn't good. Patricia's got them convinced you're some kind of environmental criminal, he told me one evening as we sat on my deck pointedly, not on the controversial dock. She's been telling people that your dock is leaching chemicals into the water, that it's destroying fish habitats, that it's going to bring the property values down. But the environmental study says exactly the opposite. I know that, and you know that, but most of these people just moved here in the last year or two. They don't know the history, and they're scared of anything that might affect their investments. Frank paused, looking uncomfortable. There's something else, David. Something I probably should have told you earlier. My heart sank. What now? Patricia's been approaching the other waterfront property owners. She's offering to help them expand their docks, bring them up to what she calls modern standards. But only after your situation gets resolved. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed made me sick. This wasn't about regulations or community standards. Patricia was systematically repositioning herself as the gatekeeper of waterfront development, using my dock as an example of what happened to people who didn't play by her rules. But I still didn't understand the full scope of what I was up against, and I wouldn't until I uncovered the truth about Patricia's real plans for Lake Harmony. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, my ex-wife, Jennifer. Despite our divorce, we'd maintained a cordial relationship, and she'd been following my HOA troubles with growing concern. Jennifer worked as a paralegal for a law firm that specialized in municipal planning, and she'd offered to do some research into Lake Harmony's zoning regulations. "David, you need to see this," she said when she called me on a Thursday evening. "I've been digging through the public records, and something doesn't add up about your HOA's authority." She'd discovered that Lake Harmony was incorporated as a planned unit development back in 1985, with very specific restrictions on what the HOA could and couldn't regulate. According to the original development agreement with the county, the HOA had authority over architectural standards, landscaping, and community amenities, but waterfront access was specifically excluded from their jurisdiction. The county retained authority over all water-related permits and regulations, Jennifer explained. Your HOA literally doesn't have the legal right to revoke your lake access or require removal of a county-permitted dock. This was huge, but it raised an obvious question. How had Patricia gotten away with threatening exactly that? The answer came when Jennifer dug deeper into the HOA's recent legal filings. Patricia had been quietly working with a lawyer to challenge the original development agreement, arguing that changed environmental conditions required expanded HOA authority. She'd filed preliminary paperwork with the county, but the case was still pending, meaning her threats about revoking my lake access were based on authority she didn't yet have and might never get. "She's been bluffing," Jennifer said. "The fines might be legitimate under HOA rules, but everything else is just intimidation." Armed with this knowledge, I decided to do some intimidation of my own. But first, I needed to understand exactly what Patricia was really after. The answer came from an unlikely source: my mailman, Jerry. Jerry had been delivering mail to Lake Harmony for over a decade, and mail carriers see things that other people miss. When I mentioned my troubles with the HOA, his face lit up with recognition. "Oh, you're the dock guy. Man, you've stirred up quite a hornet's nest." "What do you mean?" Jerry looked around conspiratorially, then leaned in closer. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I've been delivering a lot of interesting mail to your HOA president lately. Stuff from commercial development companies, Marina construction firms, that kind of thing." My blood ran cold. Commercial development? Yeah, thick packages with blueprints and site surveys. All addressed to Patricia Hendricks, but marked it confidential and Lake Harmony Development Project. I always wondered what she was planning. That evening, I called Jennifer back and asked her to research Patricia's business connections. What she found was explosive. Patricia wasn't just the HOA president, she was also a silent partner in a commercial development company called Lakeshore Enterprises. The company specialized in converting residential waterfront communities into upscale resort destinations, complete with marinas, restaurants, and vacation rental properties. But there was more. Jennifer had found preliminary development plans filed with the county under a different name, plans that showed Lake Harmony being transformed into a resort community called Harmony Bay Resort and Marina. The plans included a massive commercial dock system that would replace the existing residential docks, plus a hotel, restaurant, and shopping complex. "David, look at this," Jennifer said, sending me scanned copies of the development plans. "The proposed commercial marina is located exactly where your dock is now." Everything suddenly made sense. Patricia wasn't trying to preserve community standards, she was trying to clear the waterfront for commercial development. My dock wasn't violating regulations, it was blocking her business plan. But I still needed proof that would hold up in court, and that meant getting access to the HOA's internal documents. Fortunately, I knew someone who could help. Margie Kowalski lived 2 streets over and had served as the HOA secretary for 15 years before Patricia's arrival. She had been forced out during Patricia's modernization campaign, and she still had access to the HOA's digital archives. When I approached her with my suspicions, Margie's reaction told me everything I needed to know. "I knew something was wrong," she said, her voice shaking with anger. Patricia kept pushing through these new regulations without proper discussion, shutting down anyone who asked too many questions. And she brought in all those new residents just in time for the votes. New residents? You didn't know. Patricia's been working with a specific real estate agent to recruit buyers who would support her agenda. She basically stacked the membership with people who didn't know the community's history and would vote however she told them to. Margie agreed to help me access the HOA records, and what we found was better than I'd hoped. Patricia had been using HOA resources to pay for her development studies, routing payments through fake consulting contracts. She'd also been violating state sunshine laws by conducting HOA business in private meetings with her development partners. But the smoking gun was a series of emails between Patricia and the developer, discussing how to clear the waterfront obstacles and handle resistant property owners. My dock wasn't the only target. Patricia was systematically going after anyone whose property stood in the way of her resort development. The emails included detailed strategies for using HOA regulations to force out uncooperative residents, including escalating fines, selective enforcement, and community pressure campaigns. They'd even discussed buying out resistant homeowners at below-market rates once the harassment made their properties unmarketable. "My God," Margie whispered as we read through the correspondence. "She's been planning this for years." But Patricia's plan had a fatal flaw. She'd been so focused on clearing the waterfront that she'd forgotten about the legal requirements for commercial development. Converting Lake Harmony to a resort would require rezoning approval from the county, environmental impact studies, and public hearings, none of which had been initiated. More importantly, the original development agreement included a clause protecting the residential character of the community. Any attempt to rezone for commercial use would require approval from 75% of the property owners, not just HOA members, but everyone in the development. Patricia had been operating under the assumption that she could intimidate or buy out anyone who opposed her, but she'd made a crucial miscalculation. She'd picked a fight with someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. I spent the next week carefully planning my counterattack. With Jennifer's help, I prepared a comprehensive legal case that would expose Patricia's scheme and protect not just my dock, but the entire community from her development plans. But I wanted more than just legal victory. I wanted justice. The opportunity came when Patricia scheduled an emergency HOA meeting to finalize the dock removal process. She'd apparently grown tired of my legal stalling and wanted to force the issue with a public ultimatum. She had no idea what was coming. I arrived at the community center early and set up a laptop and projector in the back of the room. When residents began filtering in, I handed each of them a packet containing the emails, development plans, and financial records Margie and I had uncovered. Patricia entered the room like a conquering general, flanked by her hand-picked board members and followed by the same crowd of supporters from the previous meeting. She barely glanced at me as she took her position at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "thank you for coming to this important meeting. As you know, we've been dealing with a persistent compliance issue that threatens the integrity of our community standards." She gestured toward me with the dismissive wave of someone swatting a fly. "Mr. Morrison continues to refuse reasonable requests to bring his property into compliance, and his ongoing defiance has become a distraction from more important community business." The crowd murmured agreement, but I noticed some confused looks as people began reading the packets I distributed. "Therefore," Patricia continued, "the board has voted to proceed with immediate legal action to compel dock removal, followed by placement of a lion on Mr. Morrison's property to recover accumulated fines and legal costs." This was my cue. "Point of order," I said, standing up. Patricia's face tightened with annoyance. "Mr. Morrison, this is not a debate. The board has made its decision." "Actually, Patricia, I think the community has a right to know what you've really been planning for Lake Harmony. I walked to my laptop and activated the projector. The first image that appeared on the wall was the development plan for Harmony Bay Resort and Marina, with its massive commercial dock system and hotel complex. The room fell silent. "This is what Patricia has been working toward all along," I announced, "converting our residential community into a commercial resort. And my dock isn't violating community standards, it's blocking her business plan." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Residents who had been supporting Patricia suddenly found themselves looking at plans that would destroy their peaceful lakefront community. Property owners realized they'd been manipulated into attacking their own neighbors. Patricia tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous. Mr. Morrison is obviously desperate, resorting to conspiracy theories and fabricated documents. Are these fabricated?" I clicked to the next slide, showing Patricia's emails about clearing waterfront obstacles and handling resistant property owners. As I read the emails aloud, the room's energy shifted dramatically. Patricia's supporters were now demanding explanations, while the board members she'd handpicked were looking at her with growing alarm. "And here," I continued, displaying the financial records, "you can see how Patricia has been using HOA funds to pay for her development studies, routing payments through fake consulting contracts." Frank stood up from his seat near the front. "Patricia, is this true? Have you been planning to turn Lake Harmony into a resort?" Patricia's composure finally cracked. "The community needs modernization. We can't survive as a residential backwater forever. Property values, amenities, economic development." "You mean your economic development," interrupted Margie, who had been sitting quietly until now. "Using our money, our community, our homes as stepping stones for your business scheme." The meeting devolved into chaos, with angry residents demanding Patricia's resignation and answers to dozens of questions about the development plans. But I wasn't finished yet. "There's one more thing everyone should know," I said, raising my voice above the commotion. "Patricia's entire campaign against my dock has been illegal from the beginning." I explained what Jennifer had discovered about the county's retained authority over waterfront regulations, and how Patricia had been threatening to revoke lake access rights she didn't have. "The HOA has no authority to remove my dock or revoke waterfront access. Patricia has been bluffing from day one, hoping I wouldn't research the legal facts. But then I delivered the real bombshell. Which brings me to my announcement. Since Patricia seems so interested in Marina development, I've decided to pursue that option myself." I clicked to a new slide showing architectural plans that Jennifer's firm had helped me prepare. "These are the plans for Morrison Marina, a private boat facility that I'll be constructing on my property. Since the county has confirmed that my existing dock is legal and compliant, and since I have riparian rights that extend into the lake, I'm fully authorized to proceed with this expansion." The plans showed a beautiful, environmentally conscious marina that would accommodate 20 boats, include a small boat launch, and provide services for Lake Harmony residents and visitors. It was everything Patricia had been planning, but designed to enhance rather than replace the community's residential character. "Construction begins next month," I announced. "And unlike some people in this room, I'll be following all legal procedures and keeping the community informed every step of the way." Patricia was staring at the plans with a look of absolute horror. Her grand scheme was not only exposed, but I was about to implement a better version of it myself. "You can't do this," she sputtered. "The HOA will never approve." "The HOA doesn't have authority over marina construction," I reminded her. "That's county jurisdiction, remember? You should have done your research before you picked this fight." The meeting ended with Patricia's formal resignation from the HOA board, followed by the resignations of 2 other board members who had been complicit in her scheme. The remaining residents voted unanimously to rescind all fines against my property and to launch a formal investigation into the misuse of HOA funds. But the real victory came 3 weeks later, when I received a personal visit from Patricia herself. Patricia looked different when she showed up at my door that Tuesday afternoon. Gone were the pressed khakis and authority pins, replaced by jeans and a simple sweater. She looked tired, defeated, and smaller somehow than the intimidating figure who had threatened to destroy my life just months earlier. "David," she said, when I opened the door, "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I needed to come apologize." I invited her in, curious to hear what she had to say. "I got carried away," she began, sitting awkwardly on my couch while I made coffee. "The development opportunity, the potential profits, the chance to really make something significant happen. I lost sight of what this community actually means to people." She paused, staring out my window at the lake where construction crews were putting the finishing touches on my Marina expansion. "Your dock really is beautiful," she admitted. "And your grandfather sounds like he was a wonderful man. I'm sorry I tried to take that away from you." The apology felt genuine, but I was still cautious. "What happened to Lakeshore Enterprises?" Patricia laughed bitterly. "Dissolve. My business partners weren't interested in a development project that came with community opposition and legal challenges. Turns out, investors don't like controversy." "And you?" "I'm moving back to Denver. My sister lives there, and she's offered me a job with her accounting firm. Nothing glamorous, but it's honest work." We talked for another hour, and by the end of our conversation, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected: sympathy. Patricia had been wrong, terribly wrong, but she was also a human being who had made mistakes and was trying to make amends. "For what it's worth," she said as she was leaving, "your Marina is going to be incredible. The community is lucky to have you." 6 months later, Morrison Marina was in full operation. The 20-boat slips were constantly occupied. The small cafe I'd added was a popular gathering spot for residents, and the environmental improvements I'd incorporated had actually enhanced the lake's ecosystem. Property values in Lake Harmony had indeed increased, but for all the right reasons. We'd become known as a model community that balanced development with environmental stewardship, and people wanted to live in a place that had managed growth so thoughtfully. Frank became my unofficial Marina manager, greeting visitors and sharing stories about the lake's history. Margie returned to the HOA board and was elected president, bringing stability and transparency back to community governance. Even some of the residents who had initially opposed my dock became regular customers at the Marina Cafe. The legal settlement with the HOA covered all the costs of my Marina expansion, and the remaining funds were used to establish a community improvement fund that residents could access for their own property enhancements. It was a far better outcome than anyone could have imagined. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came a year later when I received a letter from a man named Tom Patterson, who lived in a community outside Dallas. His HOA was trying to force him to remove a pergola his late wife had designed, and he'd heard about my case through social media. "Your story gave me hope that I could fight back," he wrote. "And you were right. When I researched my HOA's actual authority, I discovered they were overstepping their bounds. The pergola stays, and my HOA president has learned that threats and intimidation don't work on everyone." That letter was followed by dozens of others from people across the country who had been inspired by my story to stand up to HOA overreach. Some won their battles, others reached reasonable compromises, but all of them had learned the same lesson I had: knowledge is power, and bullies only succeed when good people refuse to fight back. Today, as I write this, I'm sitting on the deck of my expanded Marina, watching the sunset paint Lake Harmony in those same shades of gold and crimson that my grandfather loved so much. The dock he built with his own hands is still here, still strong, still beautiful. But now it's part of something larger, a thriving community space that brings people together rather than driving them apart. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's building something so much better than what your enemies planned that they can't help but admire what you've accomplished. Patricia was right about one thing. Lake Harmony needed modernization. She just didn't understand that real progress comes from working with a community, not against it. And sometimes, when you're willing to fight for what's right, you end up with something far better than you ever imagined possible. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. I hope it inspires you to stand up for what's important, whether that's a family dock, a beloved garden, or just the principle that communities work best when neighbors treat each other with respect and honesty.